The knock at Dona Margarida's door was small, tentative, the kind of knock a child makes when she's practiced being quiet for too long. It was late afternoon. The sun had thinned to a gold that softened the street and made the high hedges look almost gentle. Margarida opened the door a crack and saw a little girl, no more than 8, barefoot, skirt hem dusty, eyes that flattened when she smiled like someone trying hard to be polite in a house where politeness had become a survival strategy. "Please," the girl said, her voice almost a whisper, "do you have something to eat?" The words should have been simple, ordinary, but they landed in Margarida like a stone. Something in the way the girl's hand hovered at the doorframe, too still, too patient, told a story that photographs and gala speeches couldn't touch. Margarida remembered with a sudden jolt the two. Instead, she sat with her, listening, and after a long minute she dialed a number she'd saved months earlier, a number she'd thought she might never use but kept because she had a stubborn belief that decent neighbors must be ready for the unexpected. "If this story matters to you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments," read the thin voice in Margarida's head, the digital prompt she'd heard on videos that made her feel connected to the wider world. She kept the thought, folded it away. There were practicalities to face now. By the time Rafael Mendez turned his car down the gated drive, the sky had moved from gold to a cool, clean blue. He was carrying a briefcase and the tiredness of 3 time zones, an ongoing pattern that had defined the last 7 years of his life. Business had become a machine that demanded his presence in pieces. A face at a ribbon cutting in Sao Paulo, a line read over a new building's plaque, a handshake with a minister, and a hurried return to the airport. He had been good at it. Success had a curvature that made it easy to slide into assumption. You provide, therefore you parent. He saw at first only the small figures on the neighbor's stoop. Then he saw Margarida, the way she held herself, like someone defending a small animal. Then he saw the child's skirt and bare feet, and that particular stillness that did not belong to children wrapped in privilege. The scene slammed into him all at once. The polished, comfortable certainty of his life fractured into a dozen restless shards. "Sophia?" he said before he could stop himself. The name felt strange and sharp in his mouth. The adoption certificate that had hung in the study, an off-white embossed page he had signed on a rainy Tuesday 3 summers ago, blinked into his memory. Parentage established, Sofia Alves Mendez. Date. He remembered the day with a clarity that now felt like a reproach. The courthouse fluorescent lights, the hush of the photographer's click, Christina's bright laugh that made strangers hand over champagne with ease. He had chosen to become a father to a girl who had arrived with luggage of loss. He had promised to keep her safe. "Dad?" Sophia's voice was cautious, as if she were measuring what kind of answer might be safe to hope for. Raphael's knees went a little unsteady. He had been away 2 weeks. 2 weeks had been enough. Christina stood in the doorway of the mansion then, a pale silhouette against the glass of the foyer. For a moment his mind tried to reconcile those 2 images, the woman who had made speeches about vulnerable children, who had stood at podiums preaching care, and the woman whose child was at a neighbor's door asking for food. Her expression, however, was carefully composed, not shock, not concern, but the sort of contained surprise people practiced for cameras. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. Christina's hand rose to the banister, fingers curled like a rehearsed gesture. "Margarida called. I told her to bring them back. They should be fine. The nanny was supposed to be watching." Her words arrived fast, polished like water over glass. There was no softness in them. "You shouldn't make scenes, Raphael. We have a gala tomorrow." Raphael's chest tightened at the word gala, always the gala. He felt the old pattern rising, the household primed to smooth over any image problem, the children arranged like accessories when the public eye adjusted. Something in him recoiled. He didn't argue in the hall. He didn't shout about gala schedules. He took Sophia's small, rough hand in his and guided her away from the polished doorway, away from camera-ready smiles, the way someone used to negotiating rough seas steadies a child. The nanny hovered in the background with the air of someone who'd been trained to look busy and look attentive. She avoided his eyes. That evening, in a small room at a downtown hotel, away from chandeliers and charity plate settings, Raphael sat opposite Sophia and Lucas. Lucas, a quieter boy of 10, whose small chest rose and fell as he tried to keep his breathing steady. They ate sandwiches that tasted like an odd kind of triumph. Simple, uninterrupted nourishment. Sophia's hands trembled as she held the bread,
then calmed when Raphael reached to smooth the hair from her face. "You don't have to explain everything," he said, softer now, "but I want to know what happened. You can tell me." Sophia took a breath as if preparing herself for permission. "We're not allowed to tell Mama when things go wrong," she said. "She says it will make donors worry." The word donors landed with a miserable clarity. He thought of press releases, of press walls behind which his wife had built an empire of goodwill. He thought of speeches where she had said that visibility was the path to help. The exact thing that now, in the private place where his daughter whispered about hunger, sounded like argument that would be used as an excuse. That night, Raphael did not sleep. In the lamplight, he found the adoption day photograph on his phone and stared at the small faces. He remembered the promises he had said aloud when no one else was listening. "I will protect you." He meant them in the way that men mean things that are easy to state and hard to practice. A slow, terrible self-reckoning crawled through him. Provision without presence had left a space that no toy, no scholarship fund, no private school scholarship could fill. Early the next morning, he was at his lawyer's office. Henrique Mendez, no relation, though the shared surname made every conversation seem oddly like a family deliberation, sat behind a dark wood desk that smelled faintly of old paper. Henrique had represented Raphael in business for years. He spoke in a tone that suggested everything could be managed with enough paperwork and strategy.
"You have standing," Henrique said without preamble when Raphael laid out the facts. A neighbor's call, a child at a doorstep, photographs of neglect, whispered refusals to tell the mother. Adoptive parents have the same custody rights as biological parents. We can move swiftly. Raphael wanted the word swift to mean immediate safety, a safe place for his children beyond the reach of the woman who looked immaculate under press lighting. Henrique's voice remained steady, legal, protective in its own way. "We need medical documentation," Henrique continued. "We need records, a pediatric evaluation, and a social worker's report. We need witnesses who will describe neglect and any credible proof of intent to withhold care. And we need to be cautious. Christina will likely transform every concern into an attack on you. She's savvy. She knows how to shape narrative." "The nanny, she'll say everything is fine," Raphael said, thinking of the poised woman in the hallway who avoided direct eye contact rather than answer questions. "We interview the staff," Henrique said, discreetly. "We'll need a pediatrician to document any signs of malnutrition and neglect. We'll request an urgent welfare check. And," he paused, searching for the right cadence, "we hire a private investigator. We do this by the book. No illegal surveillance. If there are recordings, they must be from lawful sources. Security footage, recordings made in common areas with consent, or materials collected through the proper channels." Raphael drove to the pediatric clinic with a certainty that felt like armor. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon-scented wipes. Dr. Juliana Arroyo came out with the soft directness Raphael had expected from the photographs on the clinic's website, and she moved through the examination with a clinical tenderness that made Raphael both grateful and ashamed. Grateful that professionals existed in the world to measure and protect, ashamed that he'd let it come to this. The pediatric exam was methodical. Dr. Juliana spoke in short, clinical sentences. Weight tracking, percentile charts, hair texture, energy levels. She pointed out medical facts without spectacle. "Sophia shows signs consistent with chronic undernutrition," she said, her finger tracing across a chart. "Not acute starvation, not by this description, but prolonged insufficient caloric intake and some vitamin deficiencies. She has signs of anxiety consistent with a child who has been afraid to speak. Those are not uncommon in neglect situations where the child believes disclosure may result in punishment." Raphael found himself listening to the factual words and collecting them like evidence. Each clinical phrase constructed a chain that could reach a courtroom, a social worker's report that could justify removing the children from an unsafe environment. He realized with a flash that love alone, his sudden presence and promises, would not be sufficient. The law required documentation. The law required a paper trail that matched sorrow. After the clinic, Enrique introduced Raphael to Marcelo Costa, a private investigator whose gray eyes looked like they'd cataloged the inconvenient truths of 100 affluent households. Marcelo was a former detective. He moved with the assurance of someone acquainted with the limits of lawful curiosity. He listened to Raphael without interruption, then outlined a plan. "We start with what's legally ours," Marcelo said. "Security footage from the mansion's cameras, only if they've been set to record common areas, and the recording is owned by the household. Staff statements, signed, in writing. Financial records that might show diversion of funds meant for the children's care. I'll look into any transfers, charity accounts, and the nonprofit structures tied to Christina's foundation. We'll interview ex-staff, those who left willingly or were dismissed. You'll want to know if there's a pattern." Raphael felt a precise and almost ridiculous gratitude. Pattern. He wanted patterns. He had suffered an aching absence that could be swathed in rational explanations until it looked like negligence. He needed proof. "Be careful with surveillance," Enrique added.
If footage exists, we ensure it's obtained lawfully. If it's going to court, the judge will ask whether it was collected in a way that respects privacy laws. We'll prepare to answer those questions. They moved carefully. Marcello interviewed the nanny in a neutral room with a recorder and a cup of coffee brought by a paralegal who prioritized calm. The nanny's answers were precise and small. She said staff rotations covered the children's days, that meals were scheduled, that a nutritionist consulted twice a month. In the hall outside, the nanny's hands trembled as she left. In the interview, her voice had the practiced steadiness of someone whose livelihood depended on staying out of the way of complicating facts. At Henrique's request, Raphael reached out to Cristina in a message that pretended calm and asked only that she come home so they could all talk. Cristina's reply was brief and measured. "We need to present a united face," she wrote. "This is private. Let's handle it discreetly. We have obligations this week. Founders Circle luncheon. I won't let our work be sabotaged by rumor." That word, sabotaged, was a shape unto itself. Henrique's jaw tightened in a quiet line. "She'll run to public narratives," he said. "Don't give her fodder." Raphael retreated for a day into the silent business of gathering professionals around the children. Dr. Patricia, a social worker from the Child Protection Agency, agreed to come by. She wore a matte coat of suit and carried a notebook that made the sound of authority. She asked the children questions that were soft at first and then precise, making notes that would go into a file that might later be entered into court exhibits.
She explained kindly to Raphael the steps that would follow: a formal report, potential supervised visits, and the need for cooperative documentation. "I'll do a home visit," she said, focusing on contact protocols. "We have to give the mother due process, but our first priority is the kid's welfare. If we have credible evidence of neglect, we can move to recommend temporary custody measures. But we need the documentation, medical reports, witness statements, and if there are recorded interactions that show deliberate withholding of food, those help. The court considers the totality of the evidence." Raphael felt the vocabulary like a manual he'd never read before. He asked questions with the single-mindedness of someone learning a new language of protection: what constituted neglect, how the agency defined chronic undernourishment, what evidence would be considered credible. Dr. Patricia answered with professional clarity, making sure at the end to ask Raphael the question that had been present since he'd carried his daughter away from the manicured foyer. "Are you prepared to change your life to be present for these children?" He wanted to say yes in a voice that would make the promise stick in the universe. He wanted to say he would quit, sell his companies, move into the hotel room forever. But reality had a different gravity. He said instead, "I will do what it takes." Days turned into a rhythm of interviews and small victories. An ex-driver named Rogelio, who had left the household 6 months earlier, agreed to speak to Marcello. He told Marcello, in the low register of someone who doesn't want to be noticed, that plates were sometimes served on tight schedules, that he had heard a woman, Cristina, saying to a staff meeting that public appearances required polish and that children don't need to know frightful things that disturb donors. Rogelio's words were careful. He said he'd seen the children left alone for stretches when the household was staffed for events. He described a climate of performance where images mattered more than interrupted care. Carla, a former babysitter, curled her fingers around a mug as she told Dr. Juliana on recorded testimony that she had been dismissed after she complained about the children's portion sizes. "I told them that a child should not be on a schedule where dinner is rationed," she said quietly. "They told me to be patient, then they let me go." As the threads tightened, Marcello found something that made his breath go brief in his chest: a transfer of funds from a private account labeled Family Trust, a fund that, on paper, had been designated for the children's schooling and care. The transfer didn't go to the trust. It passed into an account controlled by a small, newly formed nonprofit that shared an address with the philanthropic arm Cristina ran, an organization with a sleek website and glossy reports, but a bank ledger that suggested internal redirection of resources. Marcello did not overstate what a ledger meant in and of itself. Money moves in complicated paths. But the transfer offered a frame, a trail to follow: receipts for services not rendered, invoices with ambiguous descriptions, a pattern that might explain diminished provision. It was the kind of documentation that, when threaded into medical testimony and witness statements, could become a narrative in court. Raphael read the initial printouts in a conference room under the hum of fluorescent lights and felt something like faith in the law rise up. It was a strange consolation, proof that careful application of facts might translate into protection. But Henrique's face, when he closed the folder, remained guarded. "This is promising," Henrique said, "but she will fight hard. She's good at controlling impressions. Expect her PR people to push back. to paint you as impulsive, someone trying to score a publicity win. Expect calls to your board, to your partners. She'll ask for joint counseling, for mediation, for a personality assessment. Her team will try to delay. And we, Raphael asked, we compile, we fortify, we prepare for guardianship petitions, we ensure the children's needs are documented and immediate safety is secured. Outside, the mansion glittered under its own private lights, beds full of embroidered cushions, silver platters and coolers ready for parties, but the gleam was thin now, like a lacquer that had begun to flake. Christina's world was one of cameras and curated narratives. Raphael found himself thinking that the same networks that amplified her virtue could also, with a keystroke, erase it. A week into the investigation, a small but decisive piece of footage appeared. The mansion's foyer camera, one of the legally installed security devices placed to monitor deliveries in the front entry, had captured an interaction. The clip was brief: a woman's silhouette moving through the foyer, a tray in her hands, a small figure stepping close and reaching. Shot in grainy gray, the footage showed a hand withdrawing a piece of bread, a brief exchange of words, and a child's shoulders folding inward as if braced for admonition. Marcelo's hands moved over the keyboard with the clinical care of someone who knew how fragile the line between evidence and accusation could be. Henrique watched the clip and then turned to Raphael with a warning that was both legal and moral. "This shows interaction," Henrique said, "and it's admissible precisely because it's a common area camera owned by the household. But context is everything. We'll need testimony to establish intent. We'll need Dr. Juliana's findings and the staff's statements to connect this to a pattern." Raphael watched the image of his daughter on a monitor that felt too small for the enormity of what it suggested. He did not know yet whether this clip would be the thread that held the fabric of a case, or a sliver that could be dismissed as an ordinary domestic moment.
The law, like grief, required patient assembly. At home, Christina's strategy unfolded with a surgeon's precision. Her PR advisor, an efficient woman named Elise, drafted a message for staff and a brief for a carefully selected reporter. Christina appeared at a luncheon and, in a photo that would later be circulated, smiled into the camera with the spotless composure of a woman whose entire career was built on appearing unwavering. Her publicist, with a voice that practiced concern as if it were an aesthetic, suggested that the family seek counseling and that the press respect their privacy. The suggestion read to Raphael's ears like a preemptive muffling: "Let the gossip die. We'll handle the optics." He felt in those days like a man learning a choreography he'd been ignorant of for too long. The slow steps of legal motion, the quick parries of public narrative. Each move required intention, and each misstep could cost him the very thing he'd promised to protect. One evening, back in the safe room at the hotel, Sophia drew at a paper with a stub of a crayon. She drew a small house with a bright red roof, 2 stick figures, and a sun. Raphael watched her without speaking. The drawing felt like a prayer. It was small, it could fit in a pocket. He thought of the adoption certificate again, of the papers he had signed, and he understood, with the clear-eyed pain of someone who had been blind in a small but essential way, that provision had to be paired with presence to make a home. The case was far from over. There would be hearings and objections, a social worker's report, and perhaps a judge's temporary orders. Evidence needed to be assembled and presented. But in those early days, in the steady work of building a legal map to a safer life for his children, Raphael felt both rawness and a fierce clarity. He had been a receiver of trophies and honors, of boardroom accolades. Now he was learning the language of fathers, the list of what must be done, and the confession of what had been left undone. When Marcelo called late that night with news of an unexpected bank deposit revealed in an NGO's ledger, Raphael felt the new tempo of his life quicken. The discovery promised more than numbers. It promised a route to explaining the emptiness behind the polished events, the way money could be redirected while a child's plate went unfilled. But it also posed a new problem: the legal admissibility of financial records, the need for forensic accounting, the possibility that the narrative could be spun to paint him as the intruder rather than the rescuer. Henrique's voice on the phone was steady. "We proceed methodically. We bring Dr. Juliana's report to the agency. We prepare to file for emergency custody if necessary. We keep everything observed and documented, and we stay ready for her to attack our motives. People with power know how to manipulate perception."
Raphael looked at Sophia asleep in the small chair beside him, her breathing even, the slow climb of her chest a miracle he had allowed to be interrupted by absence. He placed his hand on her hair and felt, for the first time, the terrible responsibility that comes when the world is no longer content to let appearances suffice. He thought of Margarida at her kitchen table,
of the small, firm ways of neighbors who failed to be indifferent. He thought of Rogerio and Carla and their quiet willingness to step forward. He thought of Marcelo's ledger, of Dr. Juliana's chart, of Enrique's measured warnings. The truth had begun to take shape in a way he understood. Survival would be procedural as well as emotional. The path forward would require him to be present as a father and relentless as a protector. Outside, in the manicured dark, the mansion's upper windows glowed like a set of eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. Inside their small room, Raphael did not sleep again. The legal world was a map of procedures, affidavits, exhibits, hearings, the slow work of convincing an institution to take swift action. The human world was a child's need for a grown-up's constant presence. He had to bridge both. The next morning, Marcelo left with a list of places to visit: banks, charity registries, the office where invoices for the foundation's events were signed. Enrique prepared the necessary legal documents. Dr. Juliana scheduled a follow-up exam. Dr. Patricia told Raphael she would begin the paperwork for an expedited welfare check. Christina's publicist distributed a carefully phrased statement about family privacy. In the quiet between meetings, Raphael opened his phone and scrolled through a folder of photographs he had never thought he would need. Adoption day, birthday parties, a small hand resting in his palm. He tapped the image of the adoption certificate, and then, without a tremor this time, he placed it on the desk and stood up. He walked to the window, looked across the lawn to the neighbor's house, where Margarida had cleared a place at her table for a child who'd been too hungry to ask for more than bread, and he understood that the rest of his life had rearranged itself into one single task. Marcelo returned in the evening with a small stack of printouts and a calloused expression that had softened only slightly with progress. "There's a trail," he said. "Not just one ledger entry, multiple transfers, some invoices that don't match services, a contract that's missing pages. I'm ordering forensic accounting. If the money path shows funds designated for the children were diverted, that strengthens the picture. Not proof of intent by itself, but it builds context." Raphael exhaled and felt the air leave his chest in a way that felt close to a prayer. There would be more nights like this, nights of small discoveries and legal translations, nights where the world of public image bobbed against the world of private care.
He had been wealthy enough to believe that money could stand in for presence. He had been wrong. The correction would be messy and public and possibly humiliating. But for the first time since his daughter had opened that door at Margarida's house, the trajectory of his life felt like a line he could follow, one step after another, to an endpoint that would not be perfect, but would be safe. The investigation had begun. The first pieces were arranged: a pediatrician's clinical report, a social worker's pledge to document, a private investigator tracing ledgers, and witnesses gathering the courage to speak. The next moves would be fought behind closed doors: hearings, motions, PR countermoves. Raphael felt the weight of those coming days like a held breath. He bent down and whispered into the warm, hair-smelling pause between sleep and waking, "I won't let go." The promise did not fix the past, but it rearranged what the future could be. The chain of custody for that future would be measured in papers and testimony and the slow daily work of being there for a child who had once been too frightened to ask for anything but bread. At the edge of the next morning, Marcelo called again with a discovery that lifted the cadence of his voice and dropped a new, sharp piece of urgency into the room, an unexplained series of smaller transfers tied to a service that had billed for internal nutrition oversight, but for which no staff member could produce scheduled visits. There were missing logs, signatures that didn't match the handwriting of the recorded staff. It was not a verdict, it was a hook. Enrique's response was immediate. "We file a motion to preserve all financial records and to subpoena the foundation's account statements. We'll request a temporary restraining order to ensure no funds are moved until we can audit." Raphael steadied himself. The legal motion would bring the battle into a courtroom where arguments would be made, questions asked, and where a judge would weigh privacy against protection. Christina would not surrender the philanthropic stage without arguing the facts into a version that made her the harmed party. Yet somewhere beneath the legal machinery, the simplest truth remained. A child had knocked on a neighbor's door asking for food. That truth, once seen, was difficult to unsee. It had become Raphael's lodestar. He thought of the little paper house Sophia had drawn, the two stick figures under the sun. He imagined a future where that image could be more than a hopeful sketch, where the sun could be something they lived under every day rather than merely a distant promise. The next step hung like a hinge ready to move. Evidence had begun to accumulate. Witnesses were willing.
The question was no longer whether there was something wrong. The question now was whether the system, legal, social, institutional, could be mobilized quickly enough to protect two small lives before the machinery of image and power rewrote the story.
The motion was filed before the week was out. Henrique's handwriting was precise and economical. The documents read like a clean line drawn between urgency and procedure. Temporary custody, preservation of financial records, subpoena of the foundation's accounts, and a request for an expedited welfare check. The filing asked the court to consider the pediatric report, the social worker's intake, staff statements, and the security footage from the foyer as urgent indicia that the children's safety might be at risk. News of the filing leaked in the way high society stories often do, not from tabloids but from a carefully placed tip that arrived in an inbox of a reporter who had covered Christina's philanthropy. The headline arrived with a jolt for Raphael, less because of exposure than because it moved the fight from conference rooms into public air. Christina's team moved quickly. Elise drafted a statement of hurt, of privacy violated, of a family under siege by opportunistic rumors. The foundation issued an appeal for respect while promising internal reviews. For a day, feeds showed conflicting images: a woman in a white dress arranging plates labeled with donors' names, and a small child at a neighbor's door with dust on her shirt. Rodrigo Lemos, the journalist who had broken local municipal corruption stories and who had lately turned his eye to private power, reached out to Marcelo. Rodrigo did not accept tips that felt like weaponized gossip. He wanted documents, corroboration, a pattern. He met Marcelo in a diner and listened as the investigator outlined the financial irregularities, the odd invoices, the list of former staff who remembered meals rationed, the transfer to a shell nonprofit. Rodrigo's writing was shrewd and principled. His piece would need to hold to fact and avoid sensationalism. He agreed to hold publication until he had verified the documents and spoken to witnesses he trusted. In a pre-hearing conference, Henrique prepared Raphael for the most uncomfortable part of litigation. Privacy would be set against the children's welfare. Christina's counsel filed a motion to dismiss some elements as invasions of privacy. Henrique countered with case law and the unassailable logic that a child's well-being could override a desire for seclusion. Henrique stressed that the foyer camera footage, legally owned by the household and placed in a common area to supervise deliveries, would likely be admissible. The more delicate question, he said, would be whether testimony could establish pattern and intent. In that legal limbo, Raphael learned to live with the slow work of persuasion. Judges do not leap on tales of motive. They lean on documentation and professional assessments. Drachma Patricia compiled her initial report with the meticulousness of someone used to balancing empathy and exigency.
Her pages described in professional language the children's affect and behavior in interviews, the timeline of staff departures, the inconsistencies between published foundation budgets and transactional evidence. Dr. Juliana appended a follow-up to her initial chart: growth percentiles that had flattened, lab values that suggested sustained undernutrition, but nothing of a kind that demanded lurid word choice, only objective descriptions that would stand up to scrutiny. Christina's reaction was a textbook of image management. Elise crafted interviews that emphasized the family's dedication to philanthropy, that framed the case as a private matter to be handled by private counseling. Christina agreed to a remorseful social media post, not yet an apology but a promise to cooperate. Her public persona had built an entire architecture of trust. She leaned on it like a bridge that had to hold under weight. For a moment, the bridge seemed to sway. Then Rodrigo's article appeared, cautious and fact-driven. Copies of the ledgers, interviews with Rogerio and Carla, the confirmation of the foyer footage's existence, the pediatric report's key findings, and the social worker's measured concerns. He quoted an outside expert on nonprofit governance who described red flags in the foundation's transfers when funds earmarked for beneficiaries were rerouted without clear accounting. The piece did not accuse. It did what good journalism does: placed facts in public context and let institutions respond. Respond came fast. The foundation announced an internal audit and a temporary pause on public-facing events. Some board members, alarmed by the leak in Rodrigo's credible sourcing, requested emergency meetings. Christina, feeling the center of her carefully curated world vibrate, pushed back by filing counterclaims that sought to characterize Raphael's filings as theatrical and opportunistic. Courtroom dates were set. The temporary hearing would be an evidentiary crucible, where Enrique had to show probable cause for protective orders. Christina's counsel would push for deference to parental autonomy and for mediation. Judge Beatriz Santos, an experienced and unflappable jurist known for her measured demeanor, took the bench with an expression that made the room feel smaller and more honest. The courtroom was not a place Raphael loved. It smelled of old books and varnish. It was a place of formal steps and careful language. He sat beside Enrique, Sophia and Lucas on a bench behind him, guarded by his newly instituted counsel and a social worker present at the request of the court. Margarida sat in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her face the simple proof of neighborly courage. Marcelo and Rodrigo were there. Christina entered with her team, composed and radiant in a way that made the public's eyes soften. Enrique opened with a quiet clarity. He explained the chain of evidence, the pediatric report that indicated chronic undernutrition,
Patricia's intake notations, the security footage that showed an interaction where food was withheld and a child recoiled. the staff statements alleging minimized portions, and the financial trail suggesting funds intended for the children's direct care had been redirected. Henrique framed the request narrowly: temporary custody to ensure immediate safety while a full assessment proceeded, and preservation orders to prevent destruction or movement of records. Christina's attorney answered with equal precision. He argued that the footage, while owned by the household, required context, that staff accounts could be biased by grudges, and that the financial entries did not, on their face, prove intent to deprive. He pressed for an independent counselor's assessment and for strict safeguards on the children's placement, calling into question the sudden urgency of Rafael's petition. Judge Beatriz listened, then began to assemble the legal logic with the same patience Rafael had learned in Henrique's office. She asked for clarifications about the source and chain of custody for the footage. She questioned Dr. Patricia about her procedures. She considered Dr. Juliana's medical assertions. The first day of hearings was a measured war of evidence. On cross-examination, Christina's counsel tried to fracture the pediatric testimony, suggesting alternative explanations for Sophia's low percentiles, genetics, picky eating, stress from travel. Dr. Juliana remained steady. She explained how her findings matched a pattern: a plateau in growth over months, correlated with vitamin deficiencies, and an anxiety profile that reflected fearfulness around disclosure. She did not speculate about intent or malice. She testified to what was in the medical record. Margarida's testimony was brief but effective. In a voice that trembled only slightly, she described opening her door to a child asking for food, the smallness of the voice that had knocked, the way the child ate as if she expected the plate to be taken away. The image was not theatrical. It was the plain human detail of a woman who had done a simple thing: let a child in and fed her. The moment landed with the authority of ordinary decency. Carla and Rogerio testified as well. Their statements were measured, no dramatic flourishes, about meal portions, about being told to prioritize appearances, about feeling uneasy and then dismissed when they raised concerns. Their testimony was a pattern of small omissions, rather than a single violent act. That pattern was the judicial equivalent of a rope of threads. Each alone was insufficient, but taken together they began to have tensile strength. Marcelo presented the financial sequence with the careful logic of a man who knew how judges reacted to numbers. He walked through invoices, transfers, and the newly revealed nonprofit account that matched the foundation address.
Forensic accounting charts were admitted into evidence. Henrique explained that the money trail suggested resources earmarked for the children's care had been reallocated without transparent justification. Christina's counsel sought to erode those conclusions by highlighting legitimate charitable expenditures, programs, events, overhead that required funds. Henrique acknowledged the legitimacy of charitable work, but emphasized that the ledgers did not reconcile with the Foundation's stated allocations for beneficiary families, and specifically for the Children's Direct Care Trust. The judge asked pointed questions about internal controls and whether any board member had oversight of transfers. Then came the FOIA footage. Henrique had worked with the IT custodian for the household to establish authenticity and chain of custody. The clip showed a short exchange: a child reaching, an adult withdrawing a portion, a child bracing. The image was grainy but meaningful. Henrique did not allow the footage to be used as a trap for emotion. He offered it as context to the medical and testimonial evidence. Christina's counsel moved to exclude the footage as prejudicial, arguing it invited inference without explanation. Judge Beatriz considered the claim. She asked whether the camera was placed for security and whether household consent justified its use. Henrique confirmed both. The judge then weighed privacy concerns against the immediate welfare of minors. She ruled the footage admissible, with the caveat that testimony would be required to lend context. The judge's voice in that moment struck Rafael as the sound of law trying to be humane, protecting privacy, but not at the cost of safety. Henrique nodded, and a small, exhausted relief moved through Rafael. The courtroom became a place where small facts stacked into a larger truth. Dr. Patricia's testimony about the children's demeanor in interviews dovetailed with Dr. Juliana's findings and the staff's accounts. Marcela's ledger readings tied a financial pattern to institutional choices. Rodrigo's reporting, though not evidence in court, shaped public attention and made the foundation board's unease tangible. Christina's composure began to look less like innocence and more like calculation. At the hearing's close, Judge Beatriz issued a temporary but decisive order. She granted temporary custody of Sophia and Lucas to Rafael pending a fuller hearing, ordered preservation of the foundation and household financial records, and directed the Child Protection Agency to conduct an immediate, unscheduled inspection of the household and the children's living conditions. She also referred the matter to the appropriate prosecutor's office to review potential criminal investigations into misappropriation of funds and neglect. It was not a final verdict. No court could hand down a life for any person in a single motion, but it was the kind of legal hinge Rafael had hoped for.
He felt the weight of it like a tangible thing, like a small door that had finally been pushed open. Christina reacted with controlled fury. In a later press statement, she framed the judge's ruling as an overreach and promised to vindicate herself. An attorney announced that she would cooperate with the inspection. The foundation suspended some of its public programming until the audit finished. Board members issued statements of concern but stopped short of outright condemnations. For a woman whose identity was bound to public approval, the small fractures in institutional support felt enormous. The child protection inspection was the next test. Dr. Patricia led a team into the mansion with official authority. The order had made it clear they could enter common areas and request logs. They did not and could not break into locked private spaces without further court orders, but they could compare meal logs to invoices and interview staff on the spot. They found discrepancies: meal logs with dates erased, an internal calendar that showed fewer caregiver hours than the staffing model required, a pantry inventory that did not correspond with the foundation's claims of in-kind donations for family use. They did not present lurid images or sensational claims. They presented audits and professional observations. Those observations were recorded and later entered into the court file. As the legal gears turned, Raphael's world reorganized itself. Business meetings were delegated. Enrique negotiated with Raphael's board for a more sustainable schedule and for the soft removal of Raphael from some public-facing obligations. He did not quit overnight. He could not. But he did change rhythms. No more red-eyes and quick returns. No more just-overnight trips that stretched into a week. He hired a small, trusted team to handle holdings and insisted on being home for dinner. He learned, sometimes clumsily, to be present in ways that were not performative: school drop-offs, spontaneous afternoons in the park, one-on-one quiet time with Sophia, where topics could range from math to the weather without drama. Therapy began early. Raphael found a children's therapist recommended by Dr. Patricia, a woman with a calm voice who specialized in attachment work. For Sophia, initial sessions were about safety and rules, predictable routines, scheduled meals, and simple tasks that rebuilt trust: naming feelings, drawing family maps, a game about who keeps us safe. Lucas, who had been quieter, was given space to talk through what he'd been told to keep inside. Family therapy introduced rituals: a bedtime check-in, a safe word the children could use if they felt threatened, and an agreement that all concerns would be said aloud before bedtime so no one carried them alone. Community support coalesced in small, steady ways. Margarida became a daily presence, dropping off soup, staying for stories, teaching Sophia to fold napkins.
Rogerio and Carla, no longer under the shadow of the mansion's staff rotation, found jobs within the household on new terms, and sometimes sat at the table and spoke candidly about the value of consistency. Marcelo continued his inquiries at Enrique's direction, but respected the legal boundaries set for evidence. Rodrigo's follow-up pieces, balanced and factual, kept pressure on the institution rather than on the children. The foundation's public events dwindled, and the board began to ask the questions the public had a right to ask: who oversaw accounting, what safeguards existed for beneficiary funds, and how would they ensure no family under their care was at risk of neglect? Christina's isolation increased. Board members, fearful of legal exposure, started to distance publicly. Her PR counsel negotiated messages about cooperation and due process, but the sheen of automatic public worship was gone. Interviews where she had previously commanded charity audiences became small, defensive frames. At home, when reporters were not in sight, she was quiet and often unsettled, an image of someone whose private convictions did not match public performance. Legally, the case moved toward a fuller hearing. Enrique and Christina's counsel engaged in a lean contest of experts and testimony. Enrique called Dr. Juliana to the stand for a formal deposition. Her testimony was calm and factual, laying out medical findings and the standards of care for pediatric nutrition. Dr. Patricia described the children's interaction patterns and the household staffing inconsistencies. Marcelo presented reconciled ledgers and invoices. An independent forensic accountant testified to unexplained transfers to an internal nonprofit account that had limited documentation of services rendered. Christina took the stand. Her testimony was a blend of indignation and practiced vulnerability. She told a story of public service, of long hours, of sacrifices made for others. When Enrique gently asked about the children's day-to-day routines, she spoke broadly: scheduled tutoring, curated meals, careful educational choices. Under cross-examination, she became defensive, insisting that she had sought to provide for the children in ways that her public responsibilities demanded. But the question that lingered, how a child could end up at a neighbor's door asking for food, hung in the courtroom like a silent witness the law could not ignore. The climax in court was not a single dramatic reveal, but a convergence,
One by one, the elements joined: the pediatric data, the social worker's notes, the staff testimonies, the forensic accounting, and the FOIA footage that showed a pattern rather than a moment. Judge Beatrice weighed them all with the care of someone who understood the stakes.
She issued a ruling that echoed the temporary order but with more teeth. Temporary full custody to Raphael pending further investigation. Supervised visitation rights to Christina to be arranged through the Social Services Agency, and a referral to the state prosecutor to open an inquiry into potential misappropriation and neglect, an inquiry whose opening did not presume guilt, but which signaled the seriousness with which the court regarded the evidence. The ruling did not criminally convict anyone. It did, however, shift the burden of custody where the court believed immediate well-being demanded it. It authorized a more thorough forensic audit of the foundation and ordered regular status reports to the court regarding the children's welfare. Christina was stunned. The public saw a woman of power publicly restrained. Her image managers scrambled for explanations. Some board members offered quiet apologies. Donors requested transparency. After the ruling, the children moved into a modest house chosen for its stability rather than its luxury. Raphael insisted it feel like a real home. Mismatched plates, a small kettle he liked, the same rug in the hallway that Margarida had recommended because it showed less dirt and invited barefoot feet. The house smelled of new coffee and fresh cereal. It had a kitchen table where homework could be done, and where penalized failures or lost shoes would be managed with calm rather than spectacle. Healing in daily life was not instantaneous. Sophia woke some nights and required reassurance for long minutes. Lucas tested limits, small acts of defiance that had more to do with a new sense of safety than rebellion. Raphael's schedule rearranged into a tapestry of small stakes: a dentist appointment, a therapy session, a call with Henrique about the next court date, a school assembly. He learned to be present in those ways that matter most, arriving early, listening well, showing up for small requests. The children began to develop markers of predictability: Saturday pancakes, a bedtime story each night, a small ritual of checking the calendar each morning. Therapy showed slow progress. The therapist taught Raphael how to be a regulated caregiver, how to respond without panic when old fears surfaced, how to set boundaries without shame, how to create a narrative for the children that explained truth without blame. The children's drawings changed over time. The house picture that once had a small roof and 2 stick figures evolved into a scene with trees and a dog and a sun that had rays that reached the edges of the page. The drawing that once fit in a pocket grew bigger and more confident. Institutionally, the foundation began to reconfigure. Board members instituted new transparency measures, independent oversight, and clear accounting lines for beneficiary funds. The internal audit revealed processes that were lax at best and negligent at worst. It did not by itself assign criminal intent, but it allowed the staff to build better protections for the future. Christina was asked to step aside temporarily from her leadership role. Whether permanently would be decided in other venues. The public conversation shifted from scandalize and forget to questions about oversight and the responsibilities of those who work with vulnerable populations. Raphael did not relish the attention. He had wanted once a life obscured by success. Now the spotlight came with inconvenient truth, that absence had consequences. He did what he could in visible ways, supporting the therapist's work, attending school events, speaking quietly to other parents about the meaning of presence, and in invisible ways, restructuring trust documents, assigning competent managers to business concerns, and spending nights playing board games on carpets that tolerated crumbs. The months after the ruling were measured. The prosecutor's inquiry proceeded with methodical care. Subpoenas for records were issued and responded to. Investigators interviewed board members and staff. Crises came in small waves: a contested invoice, a public relations piece from a rival publication, a misquote that required correction. Each time, Raphael and Enrique navigated the moment with a mix of legal caution and a refusal to relive the children's private pain in public spectacle. Margarida remained a steady presence. She brought soup, she listened, and once she taught Sophia how to prick a lemon safely for a jam recipe. The two of them laughed at something small and private that had nothing to do with courts or ledgers. Rogerio helped install a simple shelf in the pantry, and Carla joined the new household team, not to be paid for heroics, but because she wished to help provide continuity. Marcello, the investigator, attended the occasional family dinner when Raphael insisted he be present. His role shifted from outsider to trusted ally,
someone who had once sifted through ledgers and now simply drank tea and spoke of nothing important. Christina retreated further into public statements about due process and personal transformation. She wrote an op-ed about the challenges of balancing public life with private obligations. Some readers saw it as contrition, others as deflection. The court hearings continued in the background, with scheduled status conferences and periodic reports from Dr. Patricia. The legal process gave structure to uncertainty, and structure, in its way, was healing. The epilogue of those months was not dramatic. It was in the small victories: a school recital where Sophia sang in a voice that was no longer tentative, a weekend where the family went to a park and Raphael pushed the children on swings until their shoes came off and their toes wiggled in grass. The first night Sophia slept through without waking.
Raphael learned to accept the quiet accumulation of trust, the kind that composes a home. Less public, but no less important, were the changes Raphael instituted in his own life. He took fewer flights, yes, but he also shifted priorities in ways that were deeper than schedule. He made a conscious choice to engage in the scaffolding of the children's lives, meeting with teachers, learning to cook a few staple meals, sitting through an art show. He did not wear martyrdom, he wore the clumsy gratitude of a man relearning how to care. One afternoon, months after Judge Beatrice's ruling, Sophia brought a crayon drawing to the kitchen table. It was a house this time, with many windows, a tree, 2 figures, and in the corner, a small table with a bowl. The bowl had a few simple circles inside it, and Sophia smiled with a pride that was not performative. Raphael took the drawing and, without comment, placed it into a frame on the mantel. It sat beside the adoption certificate and a small photograph of Margarida holding Sophia when she first walked into her kitchen. The framed drawing was not a vindication. It was a promise kept in small, everyday strokes. Public consequences for Christina unfolded with bureaucratic pace. The Foundation's board implemented reforms, the prosecutor's office completed a preliminary review and determined that criminal charges would be pursued in certain areas related to misallocated funds and potential neglect, an announcement that did not pronounce guilt but confirmed that the matter would move through the criminal justice system. Courts, prosecutors, and boards performed their institutional work slowly and with care. Raphael, wanting to keep his family from becoming a spectacle, declined to make public statements beyond asking for privacy and thanking those who had helped. As the legal dust settled into new routines, Raphael found himself in a mundane, holy repetition, making coffee in the morning and packing lunches the night before, reading homework aloud at the kitchen table, tucking in a child who wanted to hear the story about a brave ant who never gave up. He learned to be less effective at everything except what mattered at home. The final scenes of this chapter were not unalloyed triumph. There were setbacks, nights when Sophia would not sleep, calls from Enrique about procedural blips, and the occasional sting of a tabloid piece that preferred scandal to nuance. But setbacks were no longer unmitigated catastrophes. They were moments passed through with a plan and with people who could hold the line. Margarida, the therapist, Rogelio, Carla, Marcelo, Rodrigo's reporting that insisted on facts over frenzy, and Enrique's determined steadiness. On a quiet evening, Raphael sat at the head of the table with Sophia and Lucas, the light warm and ordinary. They ate soup that had nothing to do with gala platings and everything to do with comfort. Sophia told a joke that made everyone laugh.
Raphael thought of the man he had been, the man who thought provision could be accounted for in boarding passes and deposits, and of the man he was becoming, who measured his wealth not in assets, but in dinners kept and good nights slept. He did not pretend to have repaired everything. He did not promise permanent, easy healing, but he had learned a new grammar for family life: presence as the primary currency, transparency as protection, and the slow, daily acts of care as the architecture of home. The adoption certificate still hung in the study, now less a triumphal artifact than a reminder of a commitment that needed to be lived. Later, when Sophia asked if they could put another drawing on the mantel, a sun with 10 rays, Raphael said yes without hesitation. He understood, in a way that had cost him sleepless nights and legal battles, that the truth of parenthood was in the permission and the attendance. He had been given a second measure of trust. He would meet it with the tedious, stubborn devotion of presence. If in the eyes of the public the story left stains on reputations and on institutions, in the small private spaces of the house there was work being done to build new patterns. The children began to name people who protected them. They began to feel the authority of routine. They began to draw bigger sons. If you were moved by this story,
Consider subscribing for more stories that explore how ordinary courage and institutional accountability can combine to protect the most vulnerable. And if you can, support local child protection organizations. Small acts of care multiplied make real change.